Welcome to 2819. This is the show where we hope to inspire you to go and make disciples of all nations. I'm Sandra Dimes.
And I'm Brian Rohenbacher, and this is the television outreach of Reasons to Believe, a viewer-supported ministry where science and faith converge.
And if you'd like to support resources like this show, then visit reasons.org/2819.
And for all of you watching on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Keep up to date on all the awesome videos that RTB is putting out.
If you also want to keep up to date, check us out on social media. We're at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at 2819 Show.
And just a reminder, the podcast version 2819 is now available on Apple Podcasts and Google Play. Search Reasons to Believe podcast to get those.
They're definitely fun to listen to, so be sure you do that. Now we're going to go to a rundown of the show. First up, we have in our Nexus segment, how can there be animal death before the fall in a very good creation? This is such a hot topic. People who are concerned about our view on the age of the earth, they definitely ask this question about death before the fall. So check that out. That will be an interview coming from Coffee House Questions, and they'll be interviewing Krista Bontrager.
And in RTB 101, Krista will be talking with Ken Samples, answering the question, are alien encounters real?
And keeping on that topic of aliens, Monica Jones will be talking with Ken Samples about his book, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men.
That's one of my favorite RTB books, so definitely check that out. It has the Brian seal of approval. And make sure you stick around to the end of this program so you can get the code for that special offer.
And in our Give and Take segment, Jeff will talk with Travis Campbell about the question, what is the strongest evidence for Christianity?
And in Culture Talk, Sandra will be talking with Travis Campbell about the question, is God a moral monster? Let's check that one out.
Welcome to Culture Talk. This is the segment where we talk about the intersection of faith and pop culture and how culturally relevant topics can be used to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined today with theologian, RTB visiting scholar, and also elder at Northgate Presbyterian Church in Albany, Georgia. Yes. Travis Campbell. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We're going to be talking about a pretty relevant conversation. We see this a lot when people share things on Facebook. They might be making assumptions about the God of the Bible, and a lot of those assumptions aren't necessarily nice. It's that one of them is that God is a moral monster. You know, he allows all of these things that we wouldn't expect of a loving God. So let's tackle that question. It's a hefty one to tackle in a few minutes. So, yes. But let's begin first with kind of a common criticism that God is a genocidal ethnic cleanser. How would you even begin to tackle that question?
Well, I think that we have to attack it empathetically, because this is probably, in my estimation, one of the top arguments against the inspiration of Scripture. And I think that we have to define our terms. We need to make sure that we understand what ethnic cleansing is. And we also have to make sure we understand what the difference is between a theistic worldview and, say, a non-theistic worldview. Theists believe that God is different in kind, not just in degree from us. And because God is transcendent with respect to us, he can do things that we're not allowed to do. I think that one of the most common concerns that people have when they read texts in the Bible about God ordering the slaughter of men, women, and children in various cities is they assume that that is sort of our marching orders today, that Christians are supposed to be doing pretty much the same thing that all believers have been asked to do in the past. And so I think, number one, we have to recognize that God is metaphysically other than us and can do what we're not allowed to do. So he can take a life. I'm not allowed to do that. And when we read a text in the Bible of him giving that kind of order, we're looking at historically conditioned texts, not normative texts for all believers everywhere.
So then what would be the purpose in that type of killing, and how would we then look at that from today's lens, you know, as believers today or as skeptics today? How would we look at that?
Well, I think that when we read the overall context of these passages, we're looking at the Hebrews engaging with a culture that is not, the problem is not that they are of a different race than the Hebrews. So they're not trying to wipe out a different ethnic group just because of their race. They are engaged in practices that are extremely harmful to everyone. And so that if the children of Israel allowed them to stay in their vicinity, they would have been corrupted by the practices of those peoples. And I think Paul Copan in his book is God a moral monster? I think he's correct that the whole point was to drive them out, not necessarily to kill them, so that had these Canaanite peoples left the area, it's not like the Hebrews would have had to chase them down and make sure that they were all dead. Them getting out of the area was really the whole goal behind the killing. They were commanded to do everything up to killing them, but that doesn't mean that they actually had to do that as an absolute command. If these Canaanite peoples had gone somewhere else, there would be no command to kill them.
And when you mentioned some of the practices that were happening there, were these practices harming other people, or was it just a different belief system?
It wasn't just a different belief system. When we read about witches in the Old Testament, do not think of the pointy hat with the broomstick and cooking weird things in a pot. Think of women engaging in child sacrifice, for example, to appease a god. So this was really radical, horrendous stuff. Human sacrifice, even child sacrifice, was on the table for many of these cultures.
So then it was a protection, in a sense, to protect other people from being harmed and killed.
Yeah, so if this practice became normative among the people of Israel, it would have corroded their whole culture and people would have been harmed.
So then how can we begin as Christians to communicate to skeptics that God is a God of love when they see examples of, these killings and violent acts? How can we communicate to skeptics that God is a God of love?
Well, I think that one of the questions we need to raise is it right for a righteous judge to engage in, say, retributive justice, where people are punished for their wrongdoing? Loving people ought to engage in certain kinds of just acts. And if you agree with me that retribution is right, sometimes it is required that a very loving person engage in that kind of activity. So this is not contradictory with respect to God's love, although it is not loving for God to have done this. It is just for God to have done this. Where would I go in the Bible to show that God is a God of love? I would go to texts where, in Ezekiel 18, where God says, I do not take pleasure in the death of the wicked. Or I would go to a text like 2 Peter 3:9. God is willing that all repent and come to a knowledge of the truth. That's also combined with 2 Timothy or 1 Timothy 2:4. So these kinds of texts give us a God who really does genuinely love and desire everyone's salvation.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. I feel like we've just touched the tip of the iceberg.
We probably raised more questions than answers,
right.
But hopefully this will generate a discussion.
But your book that's coming out soon, that addresses at least part of this question. So what's the name of your book again?
It's called The Wonderful Decree, and the subtitle is Reconciling Sovereign Election with Universal Love. And I'm actually wrestling with this issue. Can God be sovereign and universally loving at the same time?
And they can find that on Amazon.
When it comes out, hopefully in the spring of 2019, they can find it on Amazon. It's coming out by Lexham Press.
Okay, thank you so much for that. If you want to hear more from Travis Campbell, visit reasons.org and search Travis Campbell. Now we're going to head to a conversation that Krista Bontrager had with Coffee House Questions. She talks about whether animal death before the fall fits with a very good creation. Let's check that out.
If the flood was local or global, is there any idea of where did the waters all come from and where did they all go? Even if it's a global flood, I mean, that's a lot of water that needs to be evaporated or something. So do we have any idea of what happened with the floodwaters?
I think a big clue about the waters comes in Psalm 104 and Proverbs chapter 8. And I've actually written another book on Psalm 104. And it's very helpful to think about Psalm 104 as a meditation from King David on Genesis chapter 1. He's kind of meditating through the days of creation. And what I find really interesting is on the third day of creation, where in Genesis 1, it talks about the land kind of appearing and separating the waters. And we might think of this from a scientific point of view as what we call continent formation, that on the third day of creation, the continents appear and the waters become separated. But what's really interesting in Psalm 104 and in Proverbs 8, God says that on that third day of creation, that the waters will never again cover the earth. that he has established a boundary for them that they cannot cross. They cannot cross the land. And so if I understand those verses correctly, and I grant you that those are the type of literature there is poetic, but we ought not fall into the trap of thinking that poetry doesn't contain truth. I mean, after all, very common argument for the dignity of humanity is Psalm 139, that I am fearfully and wonderfully made in my mother's womb. And that is a very poetic description of what we call scientifically embryonic development. But we don't look at that as being any less true just simply because it's in poetry. We just look at it as being a very beautiful poetic description of a true reality. And so when I look at Psalm 104, I see that as a poetic meditation on the events of Genesis chapter 1. And so when I see that God has set a boundary that the waters will never cross the land again, they will never again cover the earth, that makes me think that whatever is happening in Genesis chapters 6 to 9 with the flood might not be global. Because if the waters were to cover the face of the earth, the whole planet again, then I might be left in a bit of a contradiction between that view, the global flood view, and Psalm 104 and Proverbs 8. And we have another insight about this from 2 Peter. Peter describes the flood during Noah's day, and he describes it with some very interesting phrase. He says that the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. Now, why would he feel the need to offer this qualifier of the world at that time? That makes me think it's a world that's different than the world that Peter knew, the Roman world, that it had a different extent, different boundaries. So I actually think that there's some biblical evidence that tells us that these waters were not global, but rather they were local. And I think that the source of the waters was just quite simply the water cycle. It was a very large flood, and it rained hard for many days in a row, and there wasn't adequate drainage for it all to drain away and have time to dry, and over time that's what caused the flood. So it's kind of a what we might call what Hugh Ross likes to call a non-transcendent miracle. It's something that uses the natural world but is kind of controlled or intervened by God in a supernatural way. Now it's time for RTB 101. This is the segment where we talk about practical questions to help equip you to share your faith with friends and family more effectively. And I'm here once again with my friend and colleague, Kenneth Samples. Welcome, Ken.
Hi, Krista.
And I thought it would be great if we could have a conversation about alien encounters. You know, Jeff was on the show last week. We sort of talked about the question of, is there life out there from a scientific point of view? But I wanted to talk about this phenomenon of that many people seem to have experienced encounters with aliens. So help us think about that from a Christian point of view.
Well, first of all, 3 schools of thought about UFOs. One, they're all misidentified natural phenomena or human phenomena. Second broad school, they're extraterrestrial beings from other planets coming to Earth. Third perspective, what we call an interdimensional interpretation. Most of them are explained naturally. A very small percentage are real, but not physical, likely spiritual creatures.
Okay, so the reasons to believe view would be which of those 3 views?
It would adopt the third, that most UFO experiences or sightings or whatever they are can be explained naturally. But a very small, what we call residual, that can't be explained physically or in a human way. And it seems to conform to some kind of spiritual or even occult type experiences.
So when we think about alien encounters, are there some common features that people experience when they encounter an alien?
Well, you've got different varieties. You've got the contactees, which are into UFO religion, and it's a full-blown belief system. You have abductees that have some kind of contact, and it takes various steps, but it involves capture, it involves interrogation, it involves sometimes them claiming to view the ship and then some kind of return. Again, those experiences seem more psychological and spiritual than time-space real experiences.
Okay, so what we've said is that most like UFO sightings probably have a natural explanation.
99.5%.
But there are a small number that seem to be legitimate kind of alien encounters or experiences, and that really don't seem to have a natural explanation.
Right.
But people are in their right minds. They're not on drugs. They're not
Right.
severely mentally ill. They're reasonable people, but they seem to have these alien encounters. Now, what would be some, in your research, some long-term impacts that happen after these contact experiences?
Almost to a person, there are negative experiences. People have strange wounds on their body. They go through severe trauma and psychological experiences. And they have kind of an enduring difficulty with life. Not unlike, I might add, people who have occult type experiences. So again, it's hard to come up with real explanations for this phenomenon, but they almost seem religious, and they tend to be damaging psychologically, sometimes physically, and many times spiritually.
So when we think about these contact experiences from a Christian point of view, what do you think's happening here?
Well, I think the vast majority of them can be explained naturally, and I think we have to be careful not to exaggerate the number. But I do agree with you, Ross, that it's very difficult to explain that minority experiences in a purely psychological or physical way. I think that it opens the door to some type of demonic activity.
So earlier you called it an interdimensional theory. So these interdimensional creatures could potentially be an intervention of the demonic to engage us in a deception and bring harm to us?
Well, everything about the UFO phenomenon involves the strange, the bizarre, the deception. I mean, the History Channel used to be the Hitler Channel. Now it's the Alien Channel. This is something that is so popular and talked about. So, I don't want to exaggerate the numbers or the experiences, but it does seem similar to occult-like experiences, if we're to explain it at all.
Now, when we think about this whole question of is there life on other planets more broadly, not just the abduction experiences,
Sure.
but more of the theological question of if there's life on other planets, what would be the harm in that to our faith? Would there be a harm if we were to discover life on other planets?
It's interesting. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, the great Catholic philosopher, he asked the question, could there be life in other worlds? And he concluded that it's possible. I think that it would raise questions about theological issues, like who are those creatures? Are they fallen? What would be the soteriology or the method of salvation? And is the incarnation unique to Earth? So I don't think life in outer space necessarily defeats Christianity, but it does raise a lot of questions that I think we'd have to think about carefully.
Yeah, like things like if Jesus died on the cross, did that include the alien creatures too?
That's
so
right.
When we're talking to our non-Christian friends, we want to be circumspect about these issues, that some of these experiences people have with contactees do seem to be valid, but pointing out this can be damaging. But even in the broader theological conversation, life on other planets, a lot of complicated questions there theologically.
Indeed.
Yeah,
Yes.
Very good. And I want to encourage you to stay tuned because Ken's going to run over with Monica right now and talk about how you can get a special promo code to get Ken's classic book, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, to read more about this very important topic. Let's check that out.
Hey, I'm Monica Jones, and today I have author and theologian Ken Samples with me.
Hi, Monica.
Hello. So we're talking about something that seems to come up in the news all the time, UFOs and aliens. And I know you co-wrote a book, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. Tell me what that book is about.
Well, like you know, UFOs, extraterrestrials is everywhere in the news. It's on every TV program. What we did in that book is Hugh Ross is an astronomer, so he looks at all the science issues. Mark Clark knows a lot about government, military. He looks at, is the government conspiring? I looked at UFO cults and religion. And so I think you have a book that is very broad and looks at the phenomenon from a solid perspective. I'm really happy to have been a co-author of that book.
And it's from more biblical perspective too, right?
It is. It's a Christian position. We look at the phenomenon. We look a lot at Scripture because UFO religion appealed to the Bible. They talk about Jesus. So it's a Christian, we call it a rational Christian look at UFOs and extraterrestrials.
Okay, so are UFO sightings credible?
Well, I would say there are three interpretations of them. One interpretation is they're all misinterpreted natural phenomena or misinterpreted human phenomena. Another interpretation is what we call extraterrestrial. They're interplanetary space visitors visiting us from other galaxies. And then the third one is that maybe this is a religious phenomenon. So I think most of the UFO sightings and explanations can be explained naturally. Small percentage maybe can't be explained naturally and may require a more spiritual, maybe even a demonic interpretation.
Okay, so how would you suggest believers approach the subject of UFOs and ETs and all of that?
Well, one, I would say be very skeptical, be diligent, because people make all kinds of claims. And again, I think maybe 99% of the claims are not what they purport to be. I also would not get involved in any way in UFO religions or those ideas. Those are counter to historic Christianity and can be spiritually hurtful to people. And I would say, read the best possible literature. And I think our book, from a Christian point of view, would be a good book for people to begin with.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thank you again for sitting with me.
Sure, Monica.
So I hope you'd pick up a copy of Ken's book, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. And if you want one, go to reasons.org/2819. From now till August 26, you can get it for 50% off using promo code UFO50. Get yours. See you next time.
Hello, Jeff Zwerink here, and welcome again to Give and Take, the segment of the show where we explore science and thought-provoking issues to equip you to be more confident in sharing your faith. Today I'm joined by our good friend Travis Campbell, and we're going to explore what he thinks is the strongest evidence for the truth of Christianity. Travis, it's good to have you here today. So I know you've got a background in philosophy, you've got a PhD in philosophical theology, if I'm correct.
Yes.
You're the founder of a ministry called Consider This, which looks to equip people to think philosophically, scientifically, and to be prepared to share the gospel. And just from your background, as you've studied this, what do you think is the strongest evidence that Christianity is actually true?
Well, the strongest evidence that Christianity is true would consist of the evidence for God's existence and the resurrection. And I think that my favorite argument to give as a first foot forward in presenting the case for God's existence is the Kalam cosmological argument.
So kind of flesh out, I know that deals with the beginnings of things and what beginnings mean, so kind of flesh out, what is the Kalam cosmological argument?
Well, the Kalam cosmological argument is an argument that argues from the beginning of the universe to the existence of a cause of that universe. And it's very simple in its formulation. Whatever begins to exist has to have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause.
So obviously, I mean, with RTB, we've got lots of evidence pointing to a beginning of the universe, Big Bang cosmology, even the multiverse and stuff.
Sure.
Kind of practically speaking, how do you use this to go out and share the gospel? What does that look like?
Well, when I'm talking to people about my faith, I'm usually going to talk about first and foremost Christ and what he did. But if I'm talking to someone who says, well, wait a minute, I don't think that God exists in the first place, then if they say to me, well, why do you think God exists? I usually give them this argument, and it's usually very simple. I will say, do you agree with the majority of scientists who say that the universe had a beginning? I often give them the quotation of Stephen Hawking, who in his book, The Nature of Space and Time, says, everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. And then if they say, well, of course I agree with that, I will say, well, whatever has a beginning has to have a cause, and the universe had a beginning, therefore it has a cause. And I have, the vast majority of times that I've actually shared that with people, they've actually become excited about the prospect of God's existence. Many convert to theism on the spot, or at least after a few weeks of thinking about it. I've had many atheistic and agnostic students in my class. When we go over this argument, they come back weeks later, say it's very hard to get around this evidence. So the response has been very positive.
So there's a remarkable nature of what you're saying there, because that whole discussion took a grand total of a minute for you to kind of lay out the case, if that much. I mean, it really is, if there's a beginning, there needs to be a cause of that beginning. The most likely, or the best explanation is that there's, or maybe not even the best explanation, but the explanation is that there's a God. So,
yes. And in fact, I usually don't even get into how do we know that the cause is God. It's, for most people, once you explain to them that there must be a cause of the universe, that settles in their minds fairly clearly that there has to be a God.
So, I mean, you said some people have adopted theism straight away. You get fairly positive response most times from atheists or skeptics. When you get pushback, what does the pushback or the objections, how do those cash out?
Well, surprisingly, the objection that I usually get doesn't concern that second premise, which Reasons to Believe spends most of its time defending that the universe had a beginning. The pushback I usually get is on that first premise, to the effect that, yeah, that premise is true. Whatever begins to exist has a cause within the universe, but it doesn't apply to the universe as a whole. And so we spend a good deal of time talking about whether that first premise can actually be applied to the whole universe rather than just things going on in the universe.
So we've got a few minutes left here. Let's kind of cash out, or how does that conversation go? Because it seems kind of ludicrous to claim that something can begin to exist and not have a cause. What distinguishes the universe from everything else?
That's a very good question, and I usually throw that at the debate partner, if you want to call them that. I will say, well, what makes nothingness so discriminatory? Why can nothingness produce a whole universe, but it can't produce things within the universe? It seems to me that if you can produce an entire universe, then you could produce cows and cars. Why doesn't a Bengal tiger, as William Lane Craig says, just appear before us right now? So this sort of treating that first premise as a kind of arbitrary stopping point at the universe seems just to be that, an ad hoc, arbitrary resistance to the argument.
Are there people who claim that, even just without making that distinction between the universe and stuff in the universe, that would argue that, no, things can exist without a cause?
Well, we agree that things can exist without a cause, but I don't think that things that begin to exist can exist without a cause.
Okay, so this is alluding God is existing but doesn't have a cause. So it's the fact of the beginning, I guess. Okay, so let's address that question in the context of a beginning. Are there people who would claim that things can begin to exist without needing a cause?
I don't know of anybody that says things can begin to exist that has a cause, unless the universe is the exception. So I've never heard of anyone say really that things pop into being uncaused out of nothing. Now, I do know of a few scientists that have tried to appeal to quantum mechanics, and that's your field, that have tried to say that that breaks the law of causality. But my understanding of quantum mechanics is that there are many interpretations of that, and most of them are deterministic in character. The fact that I can't locate the position and velocity of a quantum particle only means that I might not be aware of what the cause is, but that's not proof that things begin to exist without a cause.
Fair enough. So do you get any pushback on the second premise that the universe has a beginning?
So far, I've never run into someone who's going to deny that premise. We live in a scientific culture in the sense that people have a very high regard to what the scientists are doing. And so the majority of scientists are telling us that the universe had a beginning. And quoting someone like Stephen Hawking, I think is good enough for most people. I don't get any pushback there.
You know, I will say I've interacted enough that I do get some of that pushback. But I think I agree with your assessment that when you look at what the bulk of scientists say, they do point to the universe having a beginning. And that really does, given the Kalam cosmological argument, point strongly in favor of a creator. I think that's a remarkable thing.
Yeah.
You know, and it really is, when we plumb the depths of Christianity and what it says about this world, if God is who he says he is, we would expect to see lots of evidence pointing to him being the creator. And when we look at the fact that the universe had a beginning and that beginning needs a cause, we can use that as a tool to go out and share with others that there is a creator, that there is a God who's created the universe for us to be here, that emphasizes that the Bible is an accurate description of things and tells us how we relate to that creator. And that's powerful and good incentive to go out and share that truth with others.
That does it for us this week on 2819.
We hope that as you've watched the show, you've been encouraged to share your faith and to do so with confidence and compassion.
And if you feel led to support resources like this, please visit reasons.org/2819.
And be sure to find us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at 2819 Show.
All right, so make sure you send us lots of likes and lots of comments. We'll see you all next time.